Good evening, everyone. My name is Kathy Pierce, and I'm the Director of Programs at the American Nutrition Association, the ANA. The ANA would like to thank Bragg Health Foundation for their support of our 2018 Global Webinar Series. Learn more about their mission to inspire and educate people to adopt a healthy lifestyle through optimal nutrition, exercise, positive attitudes, and spiritual wellness at bragghealth.org. The American Nutrition Association is very pleased to be hosting Dr. Deanna Minich tonight to help you attain physical, mental, and spiritual health through colorful whole foods and natural supplements. But let me take just a moment to tell our audience about the ANA. We are a nonprofit organization which for over 40 years has been on a mission to promote optimal health through nutrition and wellness education. We educate the public and professionals in many ways, including hosting world-class nutrition programs such as this one tonight. We encourage all of you listening this evening to visit our website at theana.org for an abundance of nutrition information, resources, and upcoming webinars. Join the ANA as a member and help us continue to bring these nutrition luminaries to you. The ANA would like to thank Now Foods for providing the technical assistance that allows us to present our webinar series. Find them at nowfoods.com. And now we're honored to introduce Dr. Deanna Minich. Dr. Minich is a functional medicine-trained clinician and researcher with a unique approach to clinical medicine which combines physiology and psychology. She has served on the Institute of Functional Medicine's Nutrition Advisory Board and Curriculum Committee, as well as on faculty, teaching nutrition for the Advanced Practice Module for Detoxification. Dr. Minich holds a master's degree in Human Nutrition and Dietetics from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a PhD in Medical Sciences from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She also holds a Certified Nutrition Specialist credential. Dr. Minich has had extensive teaching experience at the university level and serves as an adjunct professor at the University of Western States. She is both a board member and a fellow of the American College of Nutrition and a board member of Nutritional Therapy Association. Dr. Minich has over 10 years of experience working in both the food and dietary supplement industries and has authored 6 books on nutrition, wellness, and psychology, and is passionate about helping others to live well using therapeutic lifestyle changes. Dr. Minich will answer a few previously submitted questions at the conclusion of her presentation. So welcome, Dr. Minich. It is a real pleasure to have you with us this evening.
Kathy, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and I would like to thank the American Nutrition Association as well for having me. All right, hopefully everybody's seeing my screen. I'm going to talk about the rainbow diet, as you can see here, and how we can access the different foods and even different supplements in order to optimize our health and to give us a better sense of full spectrum health, as I like to call it. So keep in mind that this webinar is for informational purposes only. There's nothing here that's meant to be prescriptive, diagnostic, or even treatment oriented. This book, The Rainbow Diet, which I came out with in January 2018, really forms the basis for this presentation. So if you are interested in reading more, I would suggest the book as a reference guide, and also the way that I've written it, it's more of a workbook guidebook. Well, you know, I find it pretty interesting that after getting my master's and PhD in nutrition, that here I am talking about a very simple message, which is to eat the rainbow. So out of all of the biochemistry, all of the different dietary approaches that are out there, the dietary dogma that I'm most connected into is that which cannot be refuted, which is truly looking at the rainbow variety of plant food colors. And the way that I have looked at colors from an operating system perspective is to take East Indian and ancient traditions as a framework for then blending in a lot of the Western concepts. And so through the two, I've come to what I call food and spirit, which is a way to connect the physical with the non-physical aspects of us as human beings. And so I have different colors for the different systems of health, and what I'm going to do in this presentation is go through each of the colors, the body system that it represents, and then talk about foods and different actives that can help in the health of that particular system. So this is a more extensive, I would say, a map of sorts. It's a table that can be used in order to see how everything syncs together. And the reason why I put this together, you look at me as a nutritionist and, really with this edge of personal growth, I would say. And this came from years of seeing clients and realizing that I needed to do more than just food. I needed to bring in aspects of lifestyle, because I really have observed that how we eat is how we live, and how we live is how we eat. And so I wanted an integrated system in which I could see how all of the pieces are playing together. And so this is what I came to through my exploration, both personally and professionally. And if you look at the top here, and you can see system, these are just the code names I give for the different systems, the anatomy that it connects to, the physiology, the physiological activities that anatomy is responsible for, what are some of the more symbolic core life issues that are connected into each of those anatomical systems. That's when we start to look at health more symbolically rather than just literally. And then what can we do as it relates to lifestyle and food? So I won't be focusing on lifestyle in this presentation, but I will be focusing in on foods, the different colors of foods because of their pigments, as well as more, I would call it, the energetic properties of food, whether they're heavy and dense, moistening, warming, what are their general elemental properties. So I'll be getting into that a little bit. So indeed, I'm sure that all of us have heard that food is medicine. That quote has been around for ages from Hippocrates, and we hear a lot of it in functional medicine. And I would say that I'd like to put a word before that food is medicine and say it's colorful food that's truly medicine. But when I say colorful food, of course, I'm not talking about this. I'm not talking about food dyes. I'm not talking about colorful candy. I'm not talking about the artificial colors that we see. And in fact, it almost makes you realize the power of color and how it has been used to be enticing, to draw people in and to get them engaged. But what I'm talking about is how do we add more whole, natural, plant food colors into our eating? Because most people, and you know this, they're eating what I call the brown, yellow, and white color diet. They're eating lots of brown, yellow, and white. And I think about breakfast, case in point. You think about the average standard American breakfast, and I would even say that this is not even standard American anymore, but standard all over the planet diet. You go to, and that I can tell because whenever I'm traveling, if I'm at the hotel, I go to have breakfast, and I'm seeing a lot of these same foods. Ready-to-eat cereal, waffles, pancakes, bagels, muffins, sausage, potatoes that are fried. So then the question becomes, well, where are the healing foods? Where are the colorful foods that we need to support our physiology? If you look at the science of plant foods, and by the way, let me just put in this disclaimer. I am not wedded to any other dietary dogma other than eating colorful plant-based foods. And that doesn't mean that I'm a vegan or a vegetarian or paleo, keto, flexitarian. What I see as the unifying factor to all eating styles is having more colorful plant-based foods. And if you look at the literature, it would support that we eat according to plants and what plants are giving us. In fact, if you and I wanted to argue about dairy, I could find as many studies against dairy as probably for dairy. And if we wanted to argue about meat, I can find as many studies against meat as probably for eating meat. We could arm wrestle on a lot of these nutritional topics. But one topic we cannot arm wrestle on is the inclusion of plant-based foods like fruits and vegetables. In fact, this is a short list showing how eating plant-based foods can help to reduce the risk of chronic disease. Chronic disease is rampant, and it is pervasive, it's escalating, and there are so many different solutions to help people with all of these different diseases and much more. So yes, the way I see it, plants are the ultimate eating unifier. In fact, when I started out in nutrition decades ago, I was realizing that, my goodness, there's almost like this tug of war happening in nutrition. There is this sense of division. There's a sense of righteousness. And I was feeling that it was almost like a religion of sorts, where people were in a certain tribe and they adhered to that tribe, and if you weren't in that tribe, you weren't really connected to them. And so I had a lot of fun when I was teaching at the university a course called Redefining Nutrition, in which I had asked everybody to give themselves a dietary label, whether they were any one of these different ones that I have on the screen here: omnivore, vegan, flexitarian, vegetarian, fruitarian. Maybe they ate anything, maybe they were on an elimination diet, maybe they were gluten-free, whatever the label is. And then I asked them to take the reverse position and really come from a place of supporting it. And they had to do that verbally in class. And so what I wanted to create in that exercise was resilience, neuronal plasticity, to look for what unifies us through the experience of eating, which is embraced by all of humankind, rather than finding what divides us. And so plants, to me, are the ultimate eating unifier. And every time we eat, we are taking in thousands upon thousands of different compounds that are changing our gene expression and changing our organ reserve and function. Remember, even within functional medicine, ultimately we're looking at outcomes. What are we able to do better as a result of having through our diet, through the assimilation of this nutrient? What are we able to do better? And I just learned even last week that one of the main factors for implementing and keeping lifestyle change consistent is functional independence. We all want to have that degree of independence and functionality. And so with plant foods, because they supply a wide array, a huge palette of different phytonutrients, over thousands of different kinds, we can create better function, better diversity in the body. You know, I know as nutritionists, many times we start thinking of, I call it the three musketeers: protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And we kind of rally around those things. And we say, you know, are you in the camp of low fat or high fat, or where do you stand on protein? People are very concerned that they're not getting enough protein. So there are these macronutrient, and of course carbohydrate, I don't want to leave that one out. We already know how malign sugar is and carbohydrate in general. So there is kind of this rotation of moving amongst the macronutrients. But what I have noticed in nutrition is that the underdog is phytonutrients. These are the quiet, unspoken messengers to the cells that don't necessarily provide calories, but they do provide activity. So where do you find phytonutrients? Well, I know I mentioned fruits and vegetables already, but there is a spectrum. There's much more than that. So nuts and seeds, so many great studies on nuts and seeds, whole grains even. I know that some people don't eat whole grains or even legumes, but there are certain phytonutrients that you would find in certain concentrations in those foods. Herbs and spices are also a part of that. So one of the things that I advocate, and I hope that you walk away from this presentation with, is getting a wide array, getting a universe of different phytonutrients from many different foods and not sticking to any one particular food or food rut. So as you can see, I think in colors, I think in spectrums. It's all over the slides. And one of the things that I teach to nutritionists like you is that each food has its own signature. You know, we've entered into the age of personalized nutrition, and so every food has its own imprint. And if we start going from left to right, from red to purple, whether or not it's coming from a plant or an animal, what is its origin? And then followed by the composition of macronutrients, like I mentioned, the three musketeers, protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And then we move into its micronutrients. What are the vitamins? What are the minerals that it contains? What are the ratios of those? And is that ideal for certain functions? And then we get into phytonutrients, which I'm going to be addressing mainly in the course of this presentation, really helping us to see the complexity of them, the diversity, and how plants are very protective for our health and well-being. I do think that there's a whole area of nutrition that has remained relatively untapped, and that is in the chemosensory aspects, how we taste. And this really came to light for me when I learned back in 2005 that there are taste receptors in our gastrointestinal tract. That taste is not limited to the tongue, but that there's some functionality of taste throughout our entire being. And so to what purpose does that serve? And so it's been interesting to monitor the literature on that, looking at the gene variants of the different taste receptors and how the different variants of those receptors lead to changes in function in the body, whether it's increasing digestive enzymes, changing metabolic flexibility. It's really fascinating to see the impact of taste. Then, of course, psychoactive effects, all the different nutrients. We just wrote a blog on neuroactive ingredients or substances that are found in food. So looking at things like bananas being high in serotonin, walnuts are high in serotonin, and looking at a lot of these biogenic amines and how they occur in different foods. And then finally, what about the subtle aspects of foods, the atomic level, the electrons, the neutrons, the things that we can't necessarily see, but maybe they take on a charge. So we can see a little bit of that when we start talking about concepts like the net dietary acid load, where we do a sum of the different electrolytes that are within an eating pattern or within a food itself. So foodomics, we live in the age of the omics, and I remember Dr. Jeff Bland, who's one of my mentors, teachers, and friends, saying once that we're oming ourselves into enlightenment. I really like that because we're trying to inform ourselves better through genes and gene technologies, and oftentimes we're thinking about our own genes and getting our own genes assessed and analyzed, but what about the genes of foods? And so there is a whole science out there on foodomics, which is a new approach to food and nutrition that studies the food domain as a whole within the nutrition domain to reach the main objective, which is to help with human health. So it's really looking at the genetics of food as it meets the genetics of humans, and how do we create that interface in the best way. I've been in so many meetings and different discussions as of late, and I'm just seeing that we are on the horizon of something really exciting in nutrition. It really is around technology. It's emerging technology as it relates to assessing one's personalized needs and being able to have your smartphone sense a food, use the light on the camera, sense that through an app, and even get nutrient density. So there is a device out there that I've been using. It's more of a research device, and so these types of technologies are happening. I just came across another one, which is, and I think this is the direction we're going to go in with nutrition, which is taking a picture of your food through your phone and then having artificial intelligence and different digital sensing to extract the nutrient analysis of that plate of food. Now, I know that sounds a little bit sci-fi, it sounds a little bit far-fetched, but a lot of these projects are already underway. They've been conceived and now they are being implemented. So again, I think we are living in exciting times being a nutritionist. One thing I would like to see in terms of an app or to go further with technology, we know a lot about glycemic index. We don't know as much about phytochemical index, PI. The phytochemical index is a measure of the nutrient density of a food, essentially. So it takes into account all the different phytochemicals, and what we want with the PI is a greater PI, meaning greater phytonutrient density, versus a lower PI, which would denote less. And already there are some research studies showing that phytochemical index is inversely associated with body weight, waist circumference, and even we're starting to see some connections with inflammation. So here's the device that I was speaking to that I've started to play with a little bit. And it's evolving. You know, they have certain food categories, and so there's this little device that you see on the left. You scan it. You use that as a scanner of the food. So the phone is used for the app itself, and it Bluetooths to that device, which then can read the nutrient density or the BRICS, B-R-I-X, the BRICS or the antioxidant capacity of that food. So, you know, I can imagine, again, probably in 10 years, I'm going to the grocery store and I'm scanning foods. I'm scanning the whole bin of oranges to figure out which one is most nutrient dense and which one's going to give me the phytonutrients that I need for my personal nutrigenomic palette. So if we can be a little bit visionary to be thinking about that. So the spectrum of phytochemicals is not just about antioxidants like I just mentioned. You know, I feel like antioxidants is such a 1990s word. That was when I was doing my master's at the University of Illinois with Claire Hassler and Phyllis Bowen and many of these people that were on the cutting edge of functional foods. We were talking a lot about antioxidants. But then food started to become functional. We started to add lutein to things like prune juice. We started to make foods even more functional through the inclusion of phytonutrients. So with phytochemicals or phytonutrients, I'm using those two words interchangeably, we see a number of different roles and functions. Everything from structure, so there are certain parts of the body that collect these phytonutrients very specifically. Some of them play a role in cell signaling, and some of them go right down to the genome and interact with our gene expression. So I know you're probably thinking, okay, so she started off telling me to eat a rainbow, so is she just going to tell me to eat more fruits and vegetables? Well, in part, yes. I'm going to give you lots of rationale and tools and tips so that as you work in the field, you'll have more information and inspiration in your toolkit in order to provide people with what they need in order to get started. Because for some people, they're not even there in the realm of color. You know, you look at this study that was done by the Nutrilite Health Institute in 2009, and essentially what they found was that 8 out of 10 Americans have a phytonutrient gap, which means that 80% of people are not eating the rainbow. Like, what if we just focused there? What if we just got deeper into the rainbow rather than worrying about grams and calories and ratios of different macronutrients? You know, that is all so heady. And I don't know if moving into a lot of that analysis does everybody the same amount of good. I do think that some people have thought too much about food. They need to zoom out. They need to get a little bit more creative, artistic, and intuitive with the eating process. And I feel like color can straddle both the science and the spirit of eating. So as you look at these percentages here, what you see is that a high percentage of people are really missing out on purple and blue. So as we go through each of these colors, which I'm going to tour you through, you're going to see what are the foods, what can you do, what's the latest science. So one of the things that I talk about in the Rainbow Diet book and also my whole detox book is that what I believe that I've noticed is that there's a color code, that the way that I've structured each of the colors is that they're very specific for certain things. So as we get into the red, I'm going to talk about inflammation and the immune system. When we get into the orange, I'm going to talk about reproductive health. Yellow is digestion. We talk about acid and rotting and ripening and all of those enzyme-rich yellow foods. Green is cardiovascular, mainly because of dietary nitrates, vitamin K, chlorophyll, folates. We'll get into a little bit blue-green. And when I think of blue-green, I think of green foods that grow in the blue sea. I think of things like sea plants and sea vegetables. And then we get into the blue-purple. So the beautiful blueberry, blackberry, figs, grapes, currants, I mean, you name it, all of the bluish, purplish hues and how they benefit the brain. And then we'll close on white. And white foods are about more of the detoxification aspects, the clarification. And also, when I think of white, I also bring in discussion of intermittent fasting and looking at moving away from excessive food intake. So much like I just mentioned, I think that the newer concept in nutrition this go-around in this century is that phytonutrients aren't just antioxidants. They are very specifically placed in the body for certain functional roles. So for example, the eye in the macula, the back of the eye, the part that's responsible for vision, frontal vision, is very densely packed with lutein and zeaxanthin. So we know that having more lutein in the diet leads to less risk of age-related macular degeneration. Carotenoids, the 650 or so plant compounds in nature that embed themselves into the skin to help protect. Proanthocyanidins, which are in that blue-purplish pigment skin of berries to help with the brain activity, that those pigments actually play a role in learning and memory in the brain. So, I monitor the research on color, on chronic disease, on fruits and vegetables, on phytonutrients. So I'm always looking at what are the researchers saying about color. And this is a study that was published in 2015. It was looking at colors of fruits and vegetables and 3-year changes of cardiometabolic risk factors in adults. And here's the takeaway. They looked at colors of food and tried to correlate it to cardiometabolic parameters, and what they found is that there was a demarcation. So high intakes of red, purple fruits and vegetables were associated with lower weight and abdominal fat gain, and yellow, green, and white fruit and vegetables were related to lipid parameters, things like triglycerides and cholesterol. So I thought it was interesting that they went deep into one condition and then looked at those colors. This is another study that came out in 2017 looking at colors of fruits and vegetables and risks of colorectal cancer, essentially showing that, as we all know, higher total intake of fruits and vegetables are much more associated with reduced risk of colorectal cancer, and that green and white fruits and vegetables are protective for both men and women, and that red-purple were also protective for women but not for men. Interesting that there would be a gender effect there. There was also a statement in the study talking about how orange-yellow were linked to an increased risk of colorectal cancer. So again, this was an association study. It was epidemiological. It wasn't prospective causal. But kind of interesting to see that there are these perhaps just top-level associations. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is somewhat streamline our tour through the spectrum of research on colorful foods. And you're going to have access to this webinar, and you'll be able to see these slides. So don't worry if we don't cover something in depth. There are citations at the bottom, so you're always able to go to PubMed and look up that reference and get the specifics. So red, let's start with red. And as I mentioned, when I think of red-colored foods, I think of inflammation. I think of the immune system. There are many different phytonutrients that have what we would call pleiotropic effects, meaning they have multiple effects at many different levels. And so lycopene is one. And this is a short list, by the way. I'm not highlighting all of the phytonutrients that are found in red-colored foods. That would be too exhaustive. I'm highlighting some of the ones that have been more well-studied, I would say. So looking at anthocyanins, looking at astaxanthin. And as you can see, the beauty of nature is that these different phytonutrients are found in a spectrum of different foods throughout, even within one compound. So lycopene is not just in tomatoes, it's in watermelon, pink grapefruit, guava. I mean, there's so many different options out there. And so similar with the anthocyanins and astaxanthin. So if we look at the studies on inflammation specifically, red is a color that informs the body of alert. I actually go into the science of colors in my whole detox book. I was curious about, beyond kind of the psychological aspects, do colors in our environment signal health in any ways? And so red, what I learned about red is that it's a very reactive color. It's, why are stop signs red? It's evoking a response. And so red turns things on or off. And so that's what we're hoping to do with having these red nutrient-dense foods to really quell a lot of the red that's happening in the body. So in this particular study, tomato juice consumption was shown to reduce systemic inflammation in overweight and obese females. And there are many different studies on tomato juice, by the way, and as well as tomato consumption and lycopene. Same thing here with strawberries. Having strawberries with the meal or before the meal was really important for helping with reducing some of the pro-inflammatory effects from a meal due to the glycemic impact. Beetroot juice is also important for inflammation. In fact, I found that this was a very interesting study. They wanted to compare raw beet juice, so you just take the cooked beetroot and, well, actually it's raw in this case, but you're making juice from it, and then you're cooking it, and what are the differences between the two? And what they found in 24 people with hypertension was that, and every person was their own control. So they took each food for 2 weeks and washed out for 2 weeks, and then they switched for that 2 weeks. And what they found was more improvement in lipids with the juice versus the cooked beet. Isn't that interesting? Segmentation of different things that you find in a juice versus the whole food. But there was equal improvement on blood pressure and inflammation in both food formats. There's been a lot of work. There's a great book that's floating out there called Eating on the Wild Side by Jo Robinson. She's a writer who looked into phytochemical contents of different foods and essentially found a difference in the literature on apples. And so a gala apple has more phytonutrients, at least in the juice, than does juice made from Granny Smith, at least a small amount. My premise here is that I do believe that it's important to have variety. And yes, you may get less phytonutrients, but you may get different ones, and that's important to consider too. Okay, let's go through orange. When I think of orange, I think of reproductive health. I think of beta-carotene. I think of bioflavonoids as the phytochemicals that could belong into this segment. When we look at orange fruits and vegetables and coronary heart disease, and this was a large study, this was a prospective study with more than 20,000 men and women, and what the researchers found was that each 25 gram per day increase in the intake of these deep orange fruits and vegetables was inversely associated with coronary heart disease. In other words, it helped to reduce the risk. And of all of the deep orange fruits, carrots were associated with most of that reduction. That's a common one. Carotenoids are also, not many people realize this. And by the way, this is one of my paintings. I had a number of reproductive health issues for many years, and it was the strangest thing. I never liked to wear orange or pink, but I would always paint it. It was very interesting. And when I started to learn about beta-carotene being involved in ovulation, and even some animal studies showing that serum progesterone, which is one of the hormones that relate to ovulation, that was associated with serum beta-carotene, I started to connect the dots, and I realized how important orange is for reproductive health. So as you can see here in this study, carotenoids have been identified in the ovaries, not just beta-carotene. There are a number of carotenoids out of the hundreds that have been identified in the human ovary. This is kind of a neat study. I think that we need to pay attention to cycles, diurnal cycles, just the day-night 24-hour cycle, and also monthly cycles for women, whether or not they're cycling, and that there is a difference with respect to nutrients that flux in and flux out. This was a study, and I'd like to see more studies of this nature, because I know that different labs, when we get labs done on hormones or even lipid parameters, these can flux and vary throughout the month depending on our hormone levels. And our hormone levels are connected into our nutrient levels, of course. So this was a prospective study with 259 women. They did this for up to 2 menstrual cycles. I ideally like to see 3. I think 3 is a good tracking number in studies. But in general, this is what we have here, 2 menstrual cycles. Antioxidants were measured 5 to 8 times per cycle. And what they found was that retinol, or vitamin A, and vitamin E, alpha-tocopherol, were associated with higher estradiol. So during the times when there was higher estrogen, there was also higher amounts of these 2 fat-soluble vitamins. And then ascorbic acid was associated with higher progesterone. Now, does that mean if you give more ascorbic acid, you'll get more progesterone? I haven't seen that study, so we can't make that conclusion. But I do think it's interesting that some of these different nutrients do cycle through just like our hormones. This is also on the heels of talking about these different nutrients. Shorter time to pregnancy was observed among women with a BMI of less than 25 when they had increasing vitamin C intake. And for women who had a BMI of over 25 or at 25, when they had more beta-carotene, so that was important for them. And for women less than 35 with increasing beta-carotene and vitamin C, and women greater than or equal to 35 years with increasing vitamin E. So, lots of segmentation here, but basically what is the takeaway? That different nutrients are responsible for fertility at certain body composition and age type of segments, right? And so, yes, one of the huge things, I think, for fertility is really to look at the nutrition status, somebody's nutrient status. Are they replete, not just in protein, carbohydrate, and fat, but what about the phytonutrients? Well, I really like this study, and I continue to monitor these orange food studies just for personal interest, too. I find them fascinating. So this was looking at over 1,000 premenopausal women who were followed for 12.5 years on average. And what they found was that having one of the specific carotenoids, which is called beta-cryptozanthin. Beta-cryptozanthin is typically found in things like oranges, which is why I'm showing you the orange here. Oranges, mandarins, peaches, more of the orange fruit area of the spectrum. And so what they found was that having beta-cryptozanthin and fruit was associated with a significant delay in the onset of natural menopause. And in fact, they even quantified how much beta-cryptozanthin per day was required to delay ovarian decline by 1.3 years. It was about 400 micrograms, which is not a whole lot. It's just a consistent amount that we need. I don't think I have it in here, but I want to mention, too, there was another study that was released in 2000, I believe it was late 2017 or early 2018, showing that women, and this was a larger study as well, women who had more orange fruit consumption had a less risk of endometriosis, a 22% reduced risk of endometriosis. And again, these authors connected it to that carotenoid beta-cryptozanthin. So it's not just about beta-carotene. We have to look again at the diversity of all those different phytonutrients. Okay, moving on to yellow. Yellow is the color of happiness. There was a study in Manchester, England, that essentially asked people what their favorite colors were and then assessed their mood state. And they found that people that liked yellow the most tended to be the happiest people. So we want our guts to be happy, and that's where I focus here with yellow, with digestion, energy, and metabolism. And if you think about it, we are bombarded in our daily life with many different unhealthy yellow foods, things like yellow breads, yellow corn, yellow processed corn products is what I'm thinking of there. I'm also thinking of any number of the breakfast food items that I had mentioned before. So bringing in yellow foods that are going to spark us, that are going to give us the acids and the enzymes we need to really fuel our digestion. I also put in this category lutein, and I put in some of the green foods too. So I remember showing this slide, and somebody in the audience asked me, they said, Deanna, why do you have kale on here? That's not yellow. Well, it's not, but underneath the green, you do have an appreciable amount of the yellow phytonutrients, specifically lutein. And I could also put parsley and some of the other different green foods on here too. So, as I mentioned before, lutein is important for reducing the risk of age-related macular degeneration. It's also important for skin health, giving a supplement of lutein, in this case, with a little bit of zeaxanthin. And make sure that anytime you have a supplement in which there is lutein, that you bring in zeaxanthin, because the two carotenoids work very well together. My whole master's thesis was on carotenoids, and so I tend to be a little bit more protective of these protective phytonutrients. There's so much good research on them. So when we think of skin health, they can be helpful. They can help with hydration of the skin. And when I think of, I'm not going into lemons and the acid, or apple cider vinegar and the acid it provides to help with our stomach milieu. I'm not going to go in depth on whether it's bromelain from pineapple, or even looking at papain from papaya and some of these orange, yellow kind of foods. But there is, if we think of it that way, how do we replete? That's important, right? Here's one that Naringenin is probably a compound you've heard of, because it is in some supplements, and it's typically from citrus fruit. And what I've been seeing is that Naringenin can help with metabolic efficiency, and that's through some of the cell signaling effects on some of the protein kinases that, when they are upregulated, cause metabolic burning, metabolic efficiency, and flexibility. So that's exciting. Yellow potatoes. Now, this is a case where yellow is not as good as another color. Yellow potatoes cause a greater glycemic response than purple potatoes. So being that we're so short in purple, what I say is choose purple whenever possible. Try to say that 3 times fast. Purple whenever possible, right? So purple potatoes tend to be smaller, they're more nutrient dense, and they have a lower glycemic index. Now, one of the concepts you may have heard of is white fat and brown fat. But what not many people are aware of is this concept of beiging. I put this into the yellow category because it is about heat, it's about the fire element, and it's about sparking and heating up the metabolic efficiency of fat tissue. And so I want you to think of a continuum or a spectrum again. When we move from white adipose tissue, we can transform that tissue into brown. We want brown adipose tissue because that's the thermogenically active tissue that's full of mitochondria. That gives us a lot of heat. That is a very efficient fat. The white storage fat is just that. It's a storage depot for excessive fat. So what we want to do is create this continuum of what is called in the literature beiging. And this is a relatively new concept, I might admit. And there are certain phytonutrients that can help in that process of going from white to brown fat and having that beige fat. So I listed here some of the plant compounds. Now keep in mind that these are still cell studies, so it's premature to extrapolate and say, wow, so that means if I give a client cinnamon and resveratrol that they're going to lose weight. We just don't know. We cannot fill the gap at that level of knowledge at this point. But what we can say, I can just say this about cinnamon and resveratrol just separately from what I know about their effects on beiging, is that cinnamon is definitely an insulin sensitizer and does have some cellular signaling effects on insulin, which is important. And resveratrol can also help with AMP kinase and some of the other, the sirtuins, right? And some of the metabolic efficiency at a different cellular level. So all in all, definitely good compounds. I always prefer to get them from whole food rather than the supplement, but when needed to help with their respective functions, of course, in isolation, they may be much more active. I'm tossing into yellow here the honey. And the reason why is because usually when I talk about red, I'm also talking about protein. When I talk about orange, I talk about fats and oils. And when I get into yellow, I get into the third macronutrient, which is carbohydrate. Honey is one of those yellow foods that seems to be beneficial for multiple things. It has many different activities, and I feel like they've been really not come to light and come into that flame of discovery like I know them to be. I mean, if you just do a PubMed search on honey, you'll find favorable studies even in diabetics. So I would encourage you to look into that. There's some really good work on honey, even helping with DNA damage from pesticides. All right, let's get into green. I know we're running a bit short on time here. We're just about to close. So I want to get through green and blue, purple, and white. Green is important, as I mentioned, for circulation. There's no shortage of green foods in nature. There must be a reason why we have so many green foods. We might actually need it. And this is, again, much like the others, a short list of some of what I consider to be very important phytonutrients that are found in green foods. I'm not going to tour you through each of them, but everything from helping with methylation, helping with cellular damage, having mild phytoestrogenic effects, so competing with estrogen and quieting down some of the aggressive estrogen signal. So when we look at cruciferous vegetables and glucosinolates, which are some of the compounds that are very detoxifying in the crucifers, what we see is that they are incredible. In fact, you know, somebody just recently asked me, they said, Deanna, what is the best food for you and what is the worst food for you? And I think it was in part because I had asked Dr. Walt Willett that at dinner one night. And so when I was relaying the story, the person turned it on me and said, okay, now what would you say is the best food ever? And I had to sit and think a minute because I'm trying to think, okay, if I was stranded on a desert island, what food would I absolutely have to have? And I'm going to say, if I only get one food, I'm going to say purple broccoli. And purple broccoli does exist. I just bought some last week at my neighborhood grocery store. It's in season. And the reason why is because broccoli, you can't do wrong with broccoli. I mean, goodness, I mean, it's anti-cancer. It's anti so many different things. It's helpful for the body. It helps with hormones. It helps with detoxification. It helps with the gut microbiome. I mean, it helps with inflammation. We can go on and on and on. And I want the purple because I want those proanthocyanidins for the brain. So I'm going to say that. The worst food ever, I would say, is processed sugar. Hands down, I know Dr. Willett said for the worst food, he said meat, and for the best food, he said blueberries. So he has some good points there, but my view is just a little bit different. I do think broccoli is really amazing for what it can provide. And it's all about how we cook it, too, and how we prepare it, and how much, right? And steaming it to increase the availability of the detoxification enzymes. Here is also some work on chlorophyll. You know, what makes plants green? It's chlorophyll. And are we overlooking one of the most basic primal antioxidants and phytonutrients on the planet? Goodness, you know, there is a chlorophyll in food form. There's also chlorophyll in supplement form. It's important. It does help with reducing DNA damage. It's important, you know, there are some neat studies from Dave Heber at UCLA and some other groups where they've looked at what happens when you take something like eating a hamburger and then you couple it with a green food. And what you tend to see is that the green food tends to bind those heterocyclic amines and take them out of the body better. So they're protective. Here's that study by Dr. Dave Heber at UCLA. What they did, if you just want to listen to me talk through it, it might be easier than reading everything on the slide. Essentially, it was an acute study. They had people come into the lab, eat a hamburger. They mentioned their inflammatory cytokines, and what they found was that the inflammatory cytokines that they measured went up, and then they had them come back again, eat the hamburger, this time with half of an avocado, and what they saw was that there was no change with the avocado, so you don't get that inflammation. So it helps to modulate that inflammatory response. And avocados are just phenomenal. If you think of the amount of fiber that you get from one avocado, it's probably more fiber than most Americans get in a day. So half of an avocado is 4.6 grams. Of course, you do the math with 2, you're looking at 9.2. So, wow, that's a lot. I've seen that the average American gets between 11 to 13 grams of fiber in a day. It's also really rich in potassium. It's one of the, I think, kind of the urban myths in nutrition. We hear that bananas are like one of the best sources of potassium, but a whole avocado has more than double the potassium in a banana. So, yeah, a variety of food is good, okay? We don't want avocados every day all the time either. So some of these green foods also are bitter, and the bitter greens tend to have some gut effects. So these things extend beyond cardiovascular health. When I'm thinking of green foods in general, I am thinking of the things that vasodilate and help protect the heart, like folate, even vitamin K, which has a role in coagulation of blood. But there are some other peripheral effects as well. I'm just kind of looking for themes, but there are things outside the themes too. So we're looking at bitter compounds and how they relate to gut effects, and helping with, again, these taste receptors in our gut. When they key into bitter from green bitter foods, we tend to see some changes in gut function and mobility and motility. All right, blue-purple. You've been waiting for this one because this is the one that I mentioned that most people are deficient in. Again, 88% of people surveyed had some issue with getting that amount of blue-purple. And so when I think of blue-purple, I think of the brain. And there aren't a lot of blue-purple foods, just like there aren't a lot of yellow healthy foods. It's hard to find purple, so that's why I say choose purple whenever possible. So there are some options here. Usually people think of blueberries when they think of purple, but I want you to expand beyond that. I want you to think, like, I should even have on here purple broccoli. I didn't even put it on here. My favorite, most healthiest food, I didn't even put on here. But it's true. You can find purple varieties of other foods that aren't normally that color. I happen to put on here carrots. Purple carrots are becoming more in vogue. Purple cauliflower, I can find that at my mainstream grocery store on a regular basis. And then, of course, you've got the obvious purples. You've got the grapes and the plums, and as I mentioned, the purple potatoes and prunes and raisins, purple black rice. So there are some different purple foods. So purple, oops. I'm not sure how that skipped ahead there. There we go. So purple carrots are, if you look at the picture of them, that is really how they look. They tend to be a little bit less big and less starchy, unlike their orange counterparts. They are nutrient dense, though. So you are going to get more nutrient density for your dollar when you are purchasing these purple carrots, as well as potatoes, of course. Purple grape juice, many people have a phobia, and I've looked into this. In fact, I feel like I need to write a blog just on juicing, because there's a smart way to do juicing, and I think that juicing can be therapeutic. It just depends what's in the juice, how much is taken in, what it's complemented with, and what it's doing. What are you looking for it to do for you? There are some studies on purple grape juice and Concord grape juice helping with cognition as well as mood. This was a study in young, healthy adults, 2017, in which they found that having purple grape juice helped to improve reaction time on an attention measure, and it also helped people to be calm compared to the placebo. And I don't know if we understand how it works. There can be multiple mechanisms. I don't know if we need to know, but there is an effect here. There are a number of studies on blueberries. I did a whole webinar just on blue-purple foods just to show you the extent of science. I mean, I did a whole 1 hour just on blue-purple foods. So I'm really showing you the tippy top here. So blueberries are being shown. I mean, the animal work came out, I would say, in the 90s with Dr. James Joseph's work at Tufts. And then there started to be more clinical work. So work in humans looking at whether or not blueberries can improve cognition in older adults. these studies tend to be a little bit small, but as you can see here, this is a clinical trial in which 13 men and 24 women were recruited. It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial in which they consumed either freeze-dried blueberry, and that was the equivalent of 1 cup of fresh blueberries, or a blueberry placebo for 90 days. And they looked at balance, gait, and cognitive tests, all functional tests. And what they found was that the people in the blueberry group fared a bit better on certain aspects of the cognitive tests specifically. They didn't improve on the gait or the balance, but they did on the cognitive tests. All right, so let's close by mentioning white foods. It's really interesting. When people say, how long have you been a nutritionist, I often say since I was 9 years old. And the reason why I say that is because when I grew up in the 1970s, my mom used to say to me, Deanna, just tell the kids at school, the whiter the bread, the quicker they're dead. And she had me reading food labels at the age of 9. I knew what mono and diglycerides were. I knew things to be looking for on the labels. And I was taking my acerola cherry vitamin C every morning. I would take cod liver oil. I mean, my mom was so cutting edge, it was almost bleeding edge. And it was, I would say there's another part of this that it was kind of emotionally scarring for me because not a lot of people were into health. You know, we live in a new age and day here with really an active interest in health, and at that time there wasn't. You were on the fringe. So whenever I think of white foods, I had to kind of do some reverse thinking about it because for so long I had been thinking of white foods as being bad. and some of them are not so good for us. There is a camp, again, I think in spectrums. And if we think on one side of the spectrum, we can put into that bucket white salt, white flour, white sugar, and a lot of the processed foods that become white because of all the things that are taken out, namely the phytonutrients. And then we can look at, wow, what are all the beautiful white cleansing foods that are available to us? And what constitutes a white food? This was a study looking at an intake of white fruits and vegetables being inversely associated with incident stroke, meaning that the more, and these researchers had found apples and pears, and they counted the white flesh, which is rich in quercetin. So they counted white foods from a little bit of a different perspective, which is fine, as long as we say what we're looking at specifically. And that's what apples and pears had in common. So looking at stroke, reducing stroke risk. I think one of the foods that we become enamored with, and we tend to do this in the nutrition field, where we tend to fall in love with things. Like, I live in the Pacific Northwest, and it's all about kale. People even have T-shirts that say, I love kale. And we get into these nutrition darlings. And I think coconut has arrived at that nutrition darling type of perspective. And I do think we have to moderate how we see these different foods and not go overboard. And just case in point, I had somebody say to me, but Deanna, coconut sugar, that should be good for you, right? And I said, no, not just, sugar is sugar. And yeah, it's from coconut. We like that, but it's probably a byproduct of processing. And, I don't know what else it has in there. And we just can't just take it at face value that just because something has a halo. And I know that you are definitely discriminating in that way. I know that as nutritionists, you think like that already. What I'm really speaking to is our clients and what people come forward with and the trends that they're subject to. So anyway, there are a number of studies on coconut oil. This was looking at how we can burn fat even better. There's this whole keto approach, of course, that people are looking at. I've written a whole blog on that, really looking at the pros and cons of it. I'm not going to get into it here. I also did mention the intermittent fasting. Let me just mention before we leave white, I didn't go into that deep enough, but there are a number of white foods that we might consider for detoxification. So I think of garlic, I think of onions, I think of a lot of the allium family. I also think of sesame, and I tend to put even some of the tan foods in here that can be medicinal as well. And so, when I think of white, it's not just the white foods, what we're abstaining from and what we're bringing in, but clearing the slate, looking at the food choices that we're engaging in and getting a bit of rest, intermittent fasting, and being more diligent. The elimination diet, right? All right, so our home stretch here, you're probably wondering, with all the science that I just went through, how do you know if your body has adequate levels of phytonutrients? We don't really know. Quite honestly, I'm going to be very upfront with you. We don't have good labs and metrics. There are piecemeal analytes, things like we can look at beta-carotene, we can look at CoQ10, we can look at tocopherols. Not all nutritionists have access to that, however. So you have to find some other ways that you can assess what people are taking in. So I've created a very simple rainbow food tracker. I've created this in various formats. That can be done to see what people are eating. As I mentioned, there are some indirect and direct laboratory markers, but none of these will give you the spectrum of all the different phytonutrients. And again, we're talking about 25,000 different ones. So since we can't always know for sure, what we can do is put into play certain practices to increase colorful food intake and to get people eating the rainbow. So what might be some of the most, there's me holding my broccoli, my treasured broccoli. So what would I say? Well, I would say variety is the spice of life. Get variety, no doubt. When you have more variety, more what they call dietary diversity in the articles that I've seen, you have less food allergy, less risk of overweight, less risk of metabolic syndrome. Get spices. Spices are concentrated forms of phytonutrients, and they are truly, I would say, a pharmacy in our kitchen. Get your daily smoothie. Get lots of colors, and I like smoothies because they incorporate a number of different nutrients and put them into a more absorbable, more potentially bioavailable format for us. I do think, though, that we do need to chew, so I will often mention to chew your daily smoothie. Drink tea. That's another way to get phytonutrients. I mean, we put out an article in 2015, and looking at tea, goodness, there's so many medicinals that we can be getting just throughout the day without even thinking about it. We can make phytonutrient-infused waters, so that can add a little bit of color and flavor to our water. Having soups, sauces, broth, stews, things of this nature where we're bringing together multiple different formats of food, and so that could even be a stir fry, something where we have complexity. So eating something warm when our digestive fire is less, so maybe at night as our rhythm is moving into less digestive capacity. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this idea to combine foods for synergy. I feel like the next book I want to write is How to Eat Smart. But it's not just eating for the brain. It's really like, how do we make smart combinations of food? How do we know what to put with what in order to optimize how our body will receive that food and that nutrient? And definitely find a colorful community, because your tribe determines your intake. And if everything else fails and you can't remember any of the science, what I would say is just focus on the beauty of fruits and vegetables and the color. That's where we started off. I was in Australia lecturing. I was in Sydney, Australia, and I went to the grocery store, which I don't remember the name of, David Harris or something like that. I can't remember. They have this grocery store, beautiful grocery store. And I'm in the produce section, and I look above the produce because there's some writing up there, and I look, and there's this quote, which is right here. It said, "Don't eat vegetables because they are good for you. Eat them for one reason alone, because they are gorgeous." With that, I will leave us with eat the rainbow, be the rainbow, and any other questions you have, always feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Minich. What a terrific presentation, and how incredibly interesting and beautiful. And thank you so much for staying with us for a couple of questions that we've received. And I'll start with, what is the connection between food and mood?
Well, I didn't cite those studies in this presentation, but there is quite a number of studies now emerging on the association between eating fruits and vegetables and improving mood. In fact, a few of them suggest that by eating more fruits and vegetables, we can become more creative, more curious, and even have a better sense of well-being. And so I remember one study looking at above 7 to 8 servings per day. That's some of us can do that, and if we can't, maybe we need to do some pinch hitting with some smoothies or some purees. So I do think that our mood is so dependent on our food choices. And in the Lancet, I believe it was 2015, there was a seminal article talking about nutrition and mental health, and how we need to be looking at nutrition for the mind, much like we might look at it for gastroenterology or dermatology, that this is truly the age of the brain. And so we're learning much more about food and its relationship to our moods.
That's excellent. Thank you. And Doctor, another question. How important is this variety of food choices?
I'm so glad you bring that up, because I want everybody to have in their mind this idea of eating the rainbow. Yes, that's number one, first and foremost. And then number two, going deeper into each spectrum of each color. If we just have tomatoes day in, day out, and that's our only red food, we don't get the complexity of different phytonutrients. And so having a variety, even within each spectrum of the rainbow, I think is very important for us. And as I showed at the very end there, you can see that there are some studies that suggest that dietary diversity, as it's called, or food variety, can lead to a number of health benefits.
Wonderful. And then finally, can it really be as simple as eating the rainbow?
I've asked that question, and again, the way I started this webinar was a little bit in disbelief that here I am with all of this nutrition research background, and what I've come to is this very simple yet profound message of eating the rainbow. I think if we can get everybody on board with noticing color, and the beauty of the rainbow message is that children can get it. I talk with my 4-year-old niece about whether or not she had her rainbow today. She understands it. We were making rainbow smoothies when she was 3. And I can also go into an assisted living, or I've done a number of things with elders and really helping them to understand the importance of color. And I think we all intuitively know that color impacts us. We know because it's in our environment. We choose to wear certain colors every day. We choose a certain color car. We paint our home certain colors. And so we know that there's an impact, but now let's drive it into the eating experience and get people to experience some inspiration and some vitality through that color. I think that's the fun part.
That's terrific, and I am certainly inspired to do so. Unfortunately, Dr. Minich, our time is up, and this has just been such an enlightening evening. And we do invite our audience to learn more about your work at deannaminich.com. And so with that, I'll say good night to our audience and best of health to you all.